shadows of the plague. The year was 1348, and the air itself seemed poisoned. At first, it was whispers. Merchants returning from the southern ports spoke of a strange sickness, of bodies piling in Italy, in France, in Spain. Some said it came from the east, carried by ships heavy with silks and spices. Others swore it was God's punishment, a cleansing fire sweeping across Christendom. Whatever its origin, it came swiftly, and it came with death. In the quiet villages of England, life had always been hard but predictable. Fields were tilled, lords collected rents, and peasants bowed their heads and endured. But when the plague came, that order shattered. William, the son of a poor villain, remembered the first signs in his own village. His father, John, returned from the market one evening pale and sweating. By dawn, he was coughing blood. His mother tried to cool his fever, whispering prayers to saints, but within 2 days John lay still, his skin blotched black and purple. Then his little sister, Alice, fell ill. Her cries haunted William long after the house fell silent. Within a fortnight, William's family was reduced from 5 souls to just 2, himself and his mother. Yet even she did not last. One cold morning, he woke to find her lifeless beside him, her hand still clutching his. At 13 years old, William was alone in a world unraveling. The village around him emptied quickly. Some families fled into the countryside, hoping to escape the pestilence, but death followed them into the woods, into barns, into hidden shacks. Priests died as fast as their flock. Graves filled so quickly that men dug great pits, casting bodies in by the dozen. The sweet smell of bread ovens was replaced with the stench of decay. William wandered the fields, dazed, his stomach empty. He saw whole cottages abandoned, doors swinging open, food rotting on tables where families had once laughed. Chickens ran wild, oxen broke loose from barns. It seemed the end of the world. But amid the horror, something stirred, a strange, dangerous freedom. In the weeks after his mother's death, William discovered that the rigid chains of feudal life were loosening. There were no longer enough men to work the Lord's fields. The steward shouted, begged, even threatened, but half the village lay in the ground. Fields of wheat went unharvested. Sheep wandered untended. William, once bound by duty to labor for his lord without complaint, now found himself in demand. "Boy," the steward barked, "you'll work this land or I'll see you whipped." But William did not lower his eyes as his father once had. "There are other lords," he said quietly, surprising himself with his own boldness. And he was right. Everywhere, lords and abbots were desperate for workers. A peasant could walk away and find better pay, better food, even a roof freely offered. For the first time in living memory, the balance of power tilted. Still, the shadow of the plague hung heavy. One evening, William sat by a small fire outside an abandoned house, watching the sun sink behind fields overrun with weeds. He thought of his father's voice, his sister's laughter, his mother's gentle hand on his hair. The silence pressed in. Yet, as the flames flickered, he also thought of something new, choice. He could remain bound to this village of ghosts, or he could walk away, carrying nothing but hope. The next morning, he chose to leave. William's journey took him across a countryside transformed. Whole hamlets were deserted, churches stood empty, bells silent. On the road, he met other wanderers, a widow named Margaret, carrying a sack of her late husband's tools, a young monk whose abbey had perished, his faith shaken, and soldiers turned vagabonds, armor rusting, speaking of villages where no one remained alive. Margaret in particular struck William. Though grief had hollowed her eyes, she spoke with fierce determination. "If the world is ending," she said, "then let us build a new one from the ruins." She carried not just sorrow, but resolve. William, though young, felt drawn to her strength. Together they traveled, helping each other survive, finding food in abandoned barns, sheltering in crumbling cottages. They shared stories of what they had lost, but also of what might still be gained. Everywhere, William saw signs that the old order was cracking. Lords once proud and untouchable now begged peasants to stay, offering coin or land in exchange for labor. The plague had scythed down the mighty and the lowly alike, leaving the survivors in a strange, leveled world. But not all welcomed this change. In London and other towns, murmurs spread of a royal decree, a Statute of Laborers, that would fix wages at old levels, forbidding peasants from demanding more. William heard these words in a crowded marketplace where a clerk read the law aloud. Around him, peasants muttered darkly. "They cannot force us back," one man spat. "They will try," another answered. William listened, his heart beating faster. For the first time, he felt not just sorrow, but anger. That night, lying on straw beside Margaret, William whispered, "Do you think it can last? This freedom?" Margaret stared at the rafters above them. "Nothing lasts. But if enough of us stand together, maybe the world can change." Her words burned in him. He thought of his father, who had bowed his head all his life, and he vowed silently that he would not do the same. The plague had taken everything from him, his family, his childhood, his certainties. But it had also given him something unexpected, a glimpse of possibility. And so, in the ashes of death, the seeds of rebellion began to stir. The empty fields. The road stretched endlessly, winding through fields that once echoed with laughter, song, and the rhythmic thud of sickles in harvest time. Now they were silent, the tall grass swaying like uncut hair across the land. The Black Death had turned England into a patchwork of emptiness, villages hollowed, farms untended, churches shuttered. William walked with Margaret at his side, each step carrying them further from the life they once knew. Hunger still gnawed at their bellies, but opportunity shimmered faintly on the horizon. For the first time in his young life, William felt the strange pull of choice, a freedom that frightened him almost as much as it thrilled him. One morning, they came upon a manor surrounded by overgrown fields. Crows perched on the rooftops, their cries piercing the still air. At the gate, a weary steward called out to them. "You there? Can you work?" William hesitated. In the old days, the answer would have been automatic. A peasant did not choose. A lord commanded, and a peasant obeyed. But now, William glanced at Margaret. Her sharp eyes met his, and with a slight nod she urged him to stand tall. "I can work," William said, his voice steady. "But not for nothing." The steward blinked. "Not for?" He glanced back toward the manor, where his lord stood in silks that hung loose on his thin frame. So many had died in his household that even a boy could speak with boldness. "What do you ask?" the steward muttered. "Food, shelter, and a penny a day." A year ago, such insolence would have earned William a beating. But now the steward only swallowed hard and nodded. "Done." That evening, William ate bread thick with butter and lay on clean straw. He felt the unfamiliar weight of a coin in his pocket. It was small, but to him it glittered brighter than gold. The days that followed revealed a new England. Lords everywhere scrambled to keep their lands alive. Entire villages had vanished, their cottages collapsing into earth. Sheep roamed free across hillsides, multiplying faster than they could be sheared. Grain rotted in fields, rats growing fat in the abundance. But for survivors like William, there was chance in the ruin. He saw men who once bent their backs without question now bargaining openly, their voices steady, their demands firm. A peasant might work for one lord today, another tomorrow, and none could stop him. At night, by firelight, Margaret spoke of her dream. "I will take over my husband's trade," she said. "He was a tanner. There is still need for leather, for shoes, for harnesses. If men will not bring their skins to market, I will buy them myself. Why should I starve when the world is ripe with goods left ownerless?" Her determination lit something in William. He had lost his family, but here was a woman who had lost everything too and yet dared to dream of rebuilding. Still, not all was hope. Dark whispers grew louder. In towns, heralds read out the king's decree, the Statute of Laborers. By order of Edward, King of England, one cried in a market square, no man shall demand wages higher than those paid before the pestilence. Any who refuse to work for a fair lord shall be punished. The crowd bristled. A farmer spat on the ground. Let the king plow his own fields, then. See how he fares without us. William felt anger surge in his chest. The lords had not buried the dead. They had not sat by fevered children. They had not dug pits for neighbors when the earth froze and the bodies piled high. Yet now they dared to command as though nothing had changed. Margaret's jaw tightened. They fear us, she whispered. That is why they write such laws. Fear is a sign we are winning. Over the next months, William saw tension growing everywhere. Some lords tried kindness, offering extra food and clothes to keep their workers. Others clung to the old ways, punishing those who spoke out. But punishment no longer frightened peasants as it once had. In one village, William watched as a group of men simply walked away from their lord's fields, ignoring his shouts. They carried their tools to another manor where better wages awaited. The old bonds of servitude were breaking, link by link. At times, William wondered what his father would think. John had lived and died believing the world could not change, that a peasant's life was fixed at birth. William had bowed his head to that truth as a boy. But now, standing in fields where silence had replaced command, he knew it was a lie. One evening, William and Margaret stopped at the Crossroads Inn. Its hall was half empty, the air filled with the scent of ale and wood smoke. Travelers gathered there, peasants, friars, wandering craftsmen, all sharing stories of the new world. A bearded man at the fire spoke bitterly, the king may write his laws, but who will enforce them? The sheriffs are dead, the bailiffs buried. The plague has cut down their power as surely as it cut down our kin. A younger voice, sharp and angry, cut in, then let us make our own laws. Why should we bow to men who no longer hold the whip? If we stand together, we can demand freedom, not just higher wages. The room fell quiet. The idea was dangerous, almost unthinkable. But William felt his pulse quicken. Freedom. Not just coin, not just bread, but true freedom. Margaret leaned closer to him. Do you hear it? The spark in their words? This is only the beginning. As spring turned to summer, William noticed a shift even within himself. He was no longer the frightened boy who had watched his family die. Hard work had broadened his shoulders, travel had sharpened his wits, and companionship had given him courage. One day, as he worked in a field beside Margaret, he paused to watch the sun blaze across the horizon. The land stretched before him, fertile and waiting. For generations, it had belonged only to lords. But now? Now it seemed as if the earth itself whispered, "Take me, claim me, make me yours." That evening, he spoke softly to Margaret. If the old world is gone, what shall we build in its place? She smiled, though sadness lingered in her eyes. Something better. Something fairer. Or else all this death will have been for nothing. William nodded. He knew then that the emptiness around them was not just loss. It was possibility. And possibility, once tasted, could never be forgotten. Rising voices. The years passed, but the shadow of the plague never fully lifted. Villages still lay in ruins, fields swallowed by weeds, churches silent where once bells had rung. Yet amidst the silence, new voices were rising, voices that carried not prayers, but demands. William was no longer a boy. At 17, his shoulders were broad, his hands calloused, his eyes sharp with experience. He had worked for many lords, moving from manor to manor, always bargaining for better wages. Margaret, ever resourceful, had rebuilt her husband's trade, buying hides from desperate peasants and selling leather in nearby markets. Together they forged a fragile but hopeful life. But hope had enemies. The king's Statute of Laborers had spread bitterness like salt in a wound. Sheriffs and bailiffs tried to enforce the law, dragging men before courts, fining those who dared demand higher pay. Yet for every man punished, two more resisted. Some fled to towns where officials' reach was weak. Others struck bargains in secret. Still others sharpened their anger into words that spread like wildfire. One evening, in a crowded tavern, William listened to a traveling preacher. His voice was fierce, his eyes alight with conviction. "Brothers and sisters," he cried, "why should you bow to lords and bishops? Did God not make all men equal? Are we not born of the same earth, buried in the same ground? The pestilence has shown us the truth, none are above death. Then why should any be above life?" The crowd murmured. Some crossed themselves in fear, others nodded with fire in their eyes. William felt his chest tighten. Never before had he heard such words spoken aloud. Margaret leaned close. "Do you hear it? This is more than hunger. This is justice." In the months that followed, William saw rebellion brewing everywhere. Peasants whispered in the fields, gathered in barns by night, and spoke of freedom, true freedom, not just a coin for a day's work. They spoke of ending serfdom, of owning the land they tilled, of breaking the chains that bound them for centuries. William, once shy, found his own voice joining theirs. "My father bent his back all his life," he said to a group of men one evening, "and died with nothing. My mother served her Lord faithfully, and the plague took her like a beast in the field. If the old ways brought only misery, then let us make new ways." The men murmured their agreement, and for the first time, William felt the thrill of being heard. But rebellion was dangerous. The king's officers were not blind. Tax collectors pressed harder, demanding money for endless wars in France. New levies, like the hated poll tax, bit deep into peasants' pockets, striking even the poorest. One spring morning, William witnessed defiance turn to fire. A royal official rode into a nearby village, demanding tax from men who had nothing left to give. When they pleaded poverty, he laughed and mocked them. One farmer, gaunt from hunger, clenched his fists. "No more," he growled. Then, in a flash, he struck the official down with a hoe. The man fell, blood staining the earth. For a moment, silence. Then the crowd erupted, shouts, curses, cheers. The villagers stormed the tax collector's cart, tearing records to shreds, burning parchments in a great bonfire. William stood at the edge, heart pounding. He had just seen a man kill a royal servant, and instead of horror, the people roared with joy. That night, he sat with Margaret by the fire. "They will call us criminals," he whispered. Margaret's eyes blazed. "Then let them. If justice is a crime, let us all be guilty." Her words struck deep. William realized that the fear which had chained his parents' generation was breaking. Hunger and grief had hardened people. The plague had shown them how fragile power truly was. And now, rebellion gave them courage. Across England, sparks caught flame. Bands of peasants marched together, refusing to pay taxes, breaking into manors, and burning records. Everywhere, the cry was the same: no more serfdom, no more bondage. In taverns and churches, names began to spread, men who spoke with fire, men who dared lead. One in particular stirred William's imagination: Wat Tyler, a man of common birth who spoke like a king. He was said to be bold, clever, unafraid of lords or sheriffs. His voice carried the pains of peasants and the dream of freedom. William longed to meet him. It was the summer of 1381 when chance came. Word spread that rebels were gathering in Kent and Essex, tens of thousands strong, preparing to march on London itself. Their demands were simple yet revolutionary: The end of serfdom, fair wages, and justice for all. Margaret clasped William's hand. "This is the moment," she said. "The time to choose." Fear gnawed at him. To march was to risk death, to defy king and lord alike. Yet to remain was to live in chains forever. "I will go," William said at last. His voice trembled, but his heart was steady. Margaret smiled sadly. "Then I will go with you." As they joined the march, William saw a sight he never thought possible: peasants from every corner of England walking together, their tools raised like weapons, their banners painted with words of freedom. Old men, strong youths, women carrying children, an army of the common folk, driven not by coin or conquest but by hunger for justice. Among them, William felt both small and infinite. For the first time, he was not alone in his anger, not alone in his hope. One evening, as campfires lit the horizon, a tall man with piercing eyes strode among the people. His voice rose above the murmurs. "We march not for vengeance but for freedom. Not to burn England, but to build it anew. No man shall be master over another. No child shall be born a slave. Together, we will stand before the king himself and demand justice." The crowd roared. William's heart leapt. He knew the name before it was spoken. "What, Tyler?" That night, William could not sleep. The stars glittered above, bright and sharp. He thought of his father's weary face, his mother's fading hands, his sister's cries. He thought of Margaret's unyielding strength, of the peasants who had walked away from their lords, of the farmer who struck down the tax collector. Tomorrow, they would march into the heart of England's power. Tomorrow, they would test whether the voices of the common folk could shake the throne itself. And for the first time in his life, William felt not powerless, but ready. The march to London. The summer sun beat down upon the road, shimmering on iron tools carried like weapons. What had begun as scattered protests was now an unstoppable tide. Peasants, craftsmen, widows, and laborers, tens of thousands, moved as one body toward London. The air hummed with their chants. Freedom. No more serfdom. Justice for the people. William walked among them, the dust of the road clinging to his boots, Margaret at his side. He had never seen so many faces united by the same fire. Farmers carried sickles, smiths hefted hammers, women clutched banners stitched with crude words, when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman. It was not an army of knights, yet its power was undeniable. By night, campfires blazed across the fields like stars fallen to earth. Men sang songs of defiance, children played among tents, and preachers raised their voices to the heavens. "God made us all equal," cried one. "The lords are no better than we. The pestilence has shown that death takes king and peasant alike. Why should life not do the same?" The people roared their agreement. William felt the words burn into his heart. Margaret whispered, "Do you see it, William? This is not just hunger. This is history." When they reached Blackheath, the crowd swelled even larger. It was there that William saw him again, Wat Tyler, the man whose name had become a legend. Tyler stood tall, his eyes fierce, his presence commanding. With him was John Ball, a radical priest whose sermons had lit the flame of rebellion. Ball's voice thundered across the meadow. When Adam dug the earth and Eve spun the cloth, there were no lords. Why should we now suffer chains? Let us tear them away. The crowd exploded with cheers. William felt the ground tremble beneath their voices. He looked at Margaret, and in her eyes he saw the same fire that surged through him. The march pressed on, unstoppable. Villages emptied as more joined the cause. Lords cowered behind castle walls. Officials fled before the advancing tide. At Rochester, the rebels stormed a prison, breaking open its gates and freeing captives. At Canterbury, They destroyed tax records, casting centuries of bondage into flames. Everywhere they went, they left behind not chaos, but liberation. William marveled at it all. He had once thought peasants powerless. Now, he saw them as a force no sword could silence. At last, the spires of London rose before them. The mighty city, heart of the kingdom, where the young King Richard II waited. To William, its walls looked like a fortress of stone and pride. Yet even they seemed small before the sea of peasants at its gates. The city was divided. Some within welcomed the rebels, opening doors and cheering. Others trembled, fearing the fury of the common folk. Smoke curled into the sky as tax houses were burned, and hated officials dragged from hiding. For William, it was as though the world itself had turned upside down. The poor strode through the streets as masters, while lords hid in terror. On the second day, word spread that the king himself would meet them. Richard was only 14, scarcely older than William, yet he bore the crown of England. The news filled the rebels with hope. Face to face with the king, Margaret said softly, "Perhaps justice will finally be heard." William's heart thundered. He had never dreamed of seeing a king, let alone speaking to him. Now, he marched with thousands toward Mile End, where the boy king awaited. When they arrived, the scene was surreal. On one side, an ocean of peasants, their faces sunburned, their clothes rough, their eyes burning with hope. On the other, the young king on horseback, his robe of velvet fluttering in the breeze, his knights tense around him. Wat Tyler stepped forward, calm and resolute. "Sire," he declared, his voice carrying, "we come not as traitors but as your true people. We ask only for freedom, that serfdom be ended, that men may work for fair wages, that justice be given to all." The crowd hushed, waiting for the king's reply. Richard, boyish yet proud, raised his hand. "My people," he said, his voice trembling but clear, "you shall have your freedom. I grant it to you. Serfdom shall end. The charters will be written and sealed." For a heartbeat, silence. Then, an explosion of joy. Peasants wept, embraced, raised their tools to the sky. Margaret gripped William's hand so tightly it hurt. "It is done," she whispered. "We are free." That night, the camp at Mile End was alive with celebration. Fires burned bright, songs rang out, men and women danced. William sat by the flames, staring at the stars, unable to believe it. Freedom, something his father had never dared to dream, was now promised by the king himself. Yet Margaret's smile faded as she looked toward the city. "Be wary, William. Promises are easy when a boy speaks them. Harder when lords and bishops twist his ear." Her words lingered, heavy with foreboding. The next morning, fate turned. The rebels gathered at Smithfield for another meeting with the king. Tension crackled in the air. Tyler rode forward to speak with Richard, but the king's men were restless, their hands on sword hilts. William stood at the edge, straining to hear. Tyler's voice rang out, "We have your word, sire. Now let it be kept. Let England be free." But then, chaos. A quarrel flared, insults flew, blades flashed. In an instant, Wat Tyler reeled back, struck down by the king's men. Blood poured onto the cobbles. A scream tore from the crowd. William's breath caught in his throat. Around him, thousands roared with fury and horror. Margaret's hand clutched his arm. "They've killed him," she whispered, her voice breaking. "They've killed our leader." For a moment, it seemed the city would drown in fire and blood. The rebels surged forward, rage blazing in their eyes. But then, astonishingly, the boy king rode forward alone, his voice clear above the tumult. "My people," Richard cried. "You have no leader now, but I will be your leader. Follow me, and all will be well." The crowd wavered. Some bowed, others shouted in confusion. The fire of rebellion faltered, tangled in shock and fear. William's heart raged within him. Tyler was dead, the promise of freedom suddenly fragile. He felt the dream slipping through their fingers like sand. That night, the rebels began to scatter. Some still believed the king's words. Others, broken by the loss of Tyler, drifted back to their villages. The dream that had burned so bright seemed to gutter in the wind. Margaret sat by William, her face lit by dying fire. "Do you see, William? They fear us still. That is why they strike at our leaders. But the seed is planted. Even if they crush us now, it will grow again." William said nothing, but inside, grief and fury warred with hope. He had marched to London full of fire, seen the king's promise, and watched it turn to blood. Yet even as despair threatened, he knew Margaret was right. The seed had been sown. And seeds, once sown, always rise. Broken promises, new dawn. The streets of London were silent now, though only a few days before they had roared with their footsteps, chants, and fury of thousands. The charters that promised freedom lay on desks in the king's council chambers, carefully ignored. Serfdom was not ended, taxes remained, and the lords reasserted their power. The rebellion had failed, at least in the eyes of those who wore crowns and wielded swords. Yet for William, the march through London and the loss of Wat Tyler had changed him forever. The boy who once wandered alone through plague-ravaged villages had grown into a man who understood the force of unity, the weight of justice, and the fragility of power. He walked beside Margaret through fields outside the city, where smoke from burned cottages still drifted into the sky. Many of their fellow rebels had fled, hiding from the king's soldiers, returning home defeated and weary. Others had been captured, whipped, or executed. The air was heavy with grief and exhaustion. Margaret's hand rested on William's arm. "It is not the end," she said softly. "They may have crushed our leader, but the world has already begun to change. Did you not see how the lords begged for workers on the road here? Did you not see the fear in their eyes?" William nodded. He remembered every manor he had walked past, every steward who had pleaded for laborers, every lord who had offered coin he had never dared dream of before the plague. The world might have resisted with swords, but it could not resist numbers, or necessity. In the weeks that followed, life returned to something resembling normality. William and Margaret rebuilt their trade, buying hides from farmers who had joined the revolt, selling leather to towns where craftsmen now demanded fair wages. Word spread quickly of how those who treated their workers with respect prospered. Peasants began to negotiate more openly, pressing for higher wages, refusing to work under old, unfair terms. Lords who once relied on fear found themselves having to compromise. Even without the king's enforcement, the power of labor had shifted. William visited villages he had walked past before the revolt. Many had lost family, but they were richer in something far more valuable, confidence. Children played in streets once silent, families planted new crops in fields once abandoned. A New England was growing, not through law, not through decrees, but through the survival, courage, and vision of ordinary people. At night, William would sit by the fire, reflecting on the events that had swept him from orphaned boy to marcher in a historic rebellion. He thought of Wat Tyler, whose courage had inspired thousands, and John Ball, whose words had sparked a fire in hearts long beaten down. Their deaths had not been meaningless. The spark had ignited something deeper than any temporary freedom, awareness. People began questioning what it meant to be bound to the soil, to accept injustice silently, to obey because fear demanded it. Ideas once whispered in barns now found their way into markets, taverns, and schools. The seeds of social change, though slow to bloom, had taken root. In time, William married Margaret formally, though they had always been companions in spirit. Together, they raised children who learned that birth alone did not define a person's worth. They could read, they could aspire, and they could labor knowing their skills mattered. The idea that a child of peasants might one day own land or trade goods was no longer impossible. William never forgot the streets of London, the chants of tens of thousands, the fire that had leapt from hearts to sky. And he never forgot the lesson of the revolt: even when the powerful strike, change cannot be undone when it grows from the lives of the people. Years later, when he walked through villages now bustling with life, William would see old lords negotiating wages, merchants treating their workers with care, children learning trades freely. The world was not perfect. Tyranny still lingered in corners. Kings still ruled from palaces. But a new England had emerged, a society where the voice of ordinary people could no longer be ignored. He thought back to the plague, the first waves of death, and the desolation of his childhood. It had seemed an end, but it had been a beginning. In the ashes of loss, life had found a way to rise, stronger, wiser, and bolder. As William grew old, he told his children and grandchildren stories of the Black Death, of the march to London, of Wat Tyler, John Ball, and the peasants who had dared to demand justice. He told them how ordinary men and women, facing despair, had shaped the future by refusing to remain silent. And he always ended with the same words: "The world may bend us, the powerful may strike at us, but change begins in the hearts of the people. And once it begins, it cannot be unmade." In the end, the revolt was more than a failed march or a brief promise. It was the dawn of a new society, one where merit, courage, and perseverance could open doors previously locked by birth, one where labor was valued, and where the ordinary man learned that his voice mattered. The Black Death had taken half of England, but it had given something immeasurable to those who survived: opportunity, resilience, and hope. William walked through the fields of his youth, now cultivated and alive with harvest. He breathed deeply, the wind carrying the scent of grass, earth, and smoke from distant hearths. A New England had been forged, not by kings or law alone, but by the courage of the people, and by those who dared to rise when the world seemed finished. And in that new world, every life mattered. Every voice could be heard. Every hand could shape the future.